Greetings, Japan fans. In today's show, we are looking at some great leadership advice from Allan Smith, the previous CEO of RGA, Reinsurance Group of America. Really look forward to hearing his comments. Maishu, arigatou gozaimasu, and welcome back to the Leadership Japan series. And I'm your host in Tokyo, Dr. Greg Story, your corporate coaching and training guy, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Japan, the best-selling author of Japan Sales Mastery. And we have a new book on mastering business in Japan called Japan Business Mastery. We are broadcasting around the world from Minato-ku in the center of Tokyo, the leadership capital of Japan. This podcast brings insights, examples, and experience about leading in Japan. And trust me, it is different here, as you will hear from all of these interviews I've been doing on leading in Japan with all the top CEOs here in Tokyo. If you have feedback on the show or have preferences about potential future topics, then leave us your comments. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast. Our daily podcast lineup on iTunes looks like this. Mondays, the Cutting Edge Japan Business Show. Tuesdays, the Presentation Japan Series. Wednesdays, the Sales Japan Series. Thursdays, the Leadership Japan Series. And Fridays, the Japan Business Mastery Show. Now, before we get going, we have our handy Japanese phrase. If someone says, let's get together, let's go out, whatever, but you just need to check your schedule to see how you're situated, and you want to ask them to wait, you just say, "Chotto mate, chotto mate, chotto mate." If it was a little bit more formal situation, say you're dealing with a client, then you wouldn't say "chotto mate," that's too casual. You don't have that sort of relationship with a client. You'd say "chotto mate kudasai." "Chotto mate kudasai." That's more polite. But amongst friends, you just say "chotto mate, chotto mate, chotto mate." Just wait. Just give me 1 second. "Chotto mate, chotto mate, chotto mate." This is episode number 346. And today we are talking about hire people smarter than you and trust their judgment. Okay, today is an interview with Allan Smith, who was previously the CEO of RGA, Reinsurance Group of America, here in Tokyo, Japan. And he's still with the company in a different role now as their legal counselor, internal for the company. But he talked a bit about his days leading the company here in Tokyo. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Japan's top business interviews. I have with me today Allan Smith, an old friend of mine, who is chairman, I believe now, for RGA for APAC, Asia. Is that correct?
No, I used to be the CEO of Japan, but now I head up government relations for all of Asia.
Okay, government relations for all of Asia. That's right. I was running RGA here in Japan for many, many years. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me. So for our listeners and our viewers, can you just give us some background on what you've been doing in your career, how you wound up in Japan, how long you've been here altogether?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a lawyer. And my first job in Japan was not being a lawyer, it was being an English teacher while I was going to graduate school. But I went to law school, and then after that, I came back on a Fulbright scholarship and studied at the University of Tokyo. And finally, I had to get a job. So I took a job with a law firm in Atlanta, and that law firm sent me to Japan. So I was here for a couple of years.
What was the connection of a law firm in Japan? Did they ship you off to Japan? That must be fairly unusual, I imagine.
No, law firms at the time were branching all over the world. And this particular law firm was doing the same thing, and they were going to open a branch in Tokyo and another one in Frankfurt. So they sent me to Tokyo, and they sent another lawyer to Frankfurt.
What was the name of the firm?
King & Spalding.
Oh,
it has a Tokyo office.
Big company.
Big company, yes. Mm-hmm. Based in Atlanta, but now a worldwide firm. Mm-hmm. So I was working for King & Spalding in Tokyo, setting up their office, and there was a recession in the United States and then a recession in Japan. And the law firm thought maybe this isn't the opportune time.
What years are we talking about?
I first came to Japan in the early 70s. So I was going to graduate school here, 1976 to 1979. Then went back, went to law school, and then came back as a Fulbright scholar in 1981. And then I was sent back by my law firm in 1986. And by the way, that's when I got married to my wife, which created a link to Japan that has been very important ever since. We went back to Atlanta after they decided they weren't going to open the law firm, and my wife said, maybe we really have to be in Japan. So I got a job with American Express with the idea that they would send me to Japan. But first I spent 2 years in New York, and then came back to Japan in 1994. And I've been here ever since.
What was the job with Amex when you came back to Japan?
I was head of their legal department. And I was in New York for 2 years, and I worked for them in Tokyo for 3 years. And then I moved to AIG. I was at AIG for 13 years.
And that was as a legal in-house counsel? Or?
Right, I was the head of the legal department for Amex, covering Japan and Korea, and then went to AIG and had the same job, Japan and Korea.
And how about, when did RGA appear on there?
Well, in 2010, AIG sold its life companies in Japan. So it became a substantially different company. Plus, there was a considerable amount of change going on. And I left AIG and came to RGA, which is a life reinsurer. It doesn't do any property and casualty, only life. So that was consistent with what I've been doing before.
In what role for RGA?
I was hired as the CEO. But I'm much more comfortable doing the government relations job.
How long were you uncomfortable as the CEO?
A couple of years. The CEO is a lot like, I'm assuming like your job. You have to go out and get clients. And that's one of the reasons I left the law firm, because I found that to be a challenge. It's much easier to manage one client in your company. Some people have a knack for going out and getting business, and some people don't. When I was CEO, there were certain things that I thought I was good at. I took an interest in compliance. I took an interest in human resources, and I think some CEOs don't lift their head up and look around enough and pay attention to that kind of thing. But for me, going out and entertaining clients was a chore, not something I relished.
How about the challenges of becoming a leader in Japan? I mean, sure, some stages there with Amex and then AIG and now RGA, that you had to make that break where you're actually leading a Japanese team or a mixed team. What are some of the challenges you found? Because you've been working in the States, and here I'm back in Japan working, full-time this time. So did you notice was challenging?
Well, actually, when I worked at AIG, I had about 200 people working for me in Japan and Korea. We had 2 companies in Korea and 5 insurance companies and a couple of asset management companies in Japan. So I had a fairly large team. And I found the most difficult thing was getting people to tell me what was going on.
Why was it difficult for them to tell you what was going on?
Well, I think Japanese tend to not speak up. So you have to find strategies to get them to tell you.
And why don't they speak up?
I think it's partly cultural. I think Japanese, you have conference calls with people around the world, and there's some nationalities that like to talk, so they're talking a lot. And there are other nationalities that don't talk quite that much, but they're also opinionated. They say what they think. But, you get to Japan and people are fairly quiet. You have to ask them what they're thinking before you get an opinion. And sometimes it's very guarded. So I think the biggest challenge in an organization that's big is finding out what's really going on. And we had several companies, and the companies also had personalities. So there was one company where they would argue with me about what to do.
These are Japanese.
Yes, they would argue about what they thought was right, what they think. The line was, this is Japan, so we have to do it this way. They would argue about it, but ultimately they would do what they were asked to do. We had another company, and they would just tell me that they were going to do what I said, and then they would go off and do what they thought was right. So that was a real problem. And I found out about this by reading their emails. They didn't think I could read Japanese. And I said, you told me this, but I'm reading that, and it's not the same. So
how did they think they could get away with telling the boss that, yes, we're going to do what the boss wants, but secretly we're going to do the exact opposite, and imagine that that was okay?
Well, I think it's tone at the top. Every company has a little personality, and this particular company, although it was an AIG company, had been founded by someone from AIU, who I think his personality was to do that kind of thing. So there's a culture in this company of telling the foreigners what they wanted to hear, and then going off and doing the right thing. And if the foreigners didn't find out about it, that's fine. But the other company was quite different. They were more forthcoming. They would banter with you and ultimately come to a decision and then do what the company decided. So, from that experience, I'd say it depends. But in general, if you're talking about the Japanese organization, they're a little bit more reluctant than other nationalities to come out and state a forthright, honest opinion. However, they do talk among themselves. So I was very lucky. I had a secretary who was in on all the office gossip, and she would come and tell me what was really going on. The boss is the last to find out what's really going on. Yeah, so I had an agent, a secret agent. But she was listening to the other employees, and she would tell me what they were saying, and so then I could go and talk to them. But I think getting people to tell you what they're really thinking can be a challenge in an organization. One thing, just be careful about tapping the table with your hands, because it'll probably get picked up on the mics by this drumming sound in the background. Okay. Let me just, while we're taking that break, I'll just check the sound, check the video. But this is fascinating. I want to hear more about this, because for me, this is not surprising. But for a lot of people who don't know Japan, this would be like, huh? All looking good. Okay. So, thank you. All looking good. So, Allan, when you found out that reading the emails, okay, you think one thing's happening, but in fact they're doing the exact opposite, how did you approach them, having discovered that? Well, actually, I confronted them with it, because I was the head of legal and compliance, and if they're not doing something that compliance or legal tells them, it could be a problem for the company. So in some cases, we actually had to make personnel changes. That's serious. Yeah. I mean, I recall on one occasion, the head of compliance told me they had two sets of files. One that he kept at the office there, one he kept at home. This is the head of compliance? Yes, this is when I joined. And I was interviewing this head of compliance for one of the companies. And he told me they had two sets of files. So he had to go. The head of compliance can't be somebody who thinks compliance is what you can get away with. It's not good for the company. No transparency. But interestingly enough, obviously in the previous regime, before you got there, that was acceptable. I don't think it was acceptable to the overall management of the company. It was acceptable within this particular subsidiary that had a culture of doing that kind of thing, which needed to be changed. So that was one of my first challenges in that job, was we had multiple companies, and this one in particular had a big issue in that regard. So. And was it very difficult to fire somebody like that in that position? Was he a fairly senior person on reasonably big money? Well, in Japanese, this is many years ago, and it's changed, but at the time, compliance was where you put someone who was close to retirement. and wasn't going to move up in the organization. It was kind of, there's an expression in Japanese, mato giwazoku, people who sit by the window and look out. In Japanese companies, I think compliance at the time, this is 20 years ago, was viewed as something that you had to have because it was required by a regulator, but you didn't want to take it too seriously because it could get in the way of your business.
That, by the way, is a beautiful summary, I think, of the problem, yeah.
Yeah, so that was one of my first challenges. And again, it wasn't the overall organization. It was one particular company, and many that had a culture about being a little bit loose with the facts.
And how about the other company where the people were more opinionated? They had a view, you had a different view. Ultimately, they did what the company ordered them to do. But how did you approach them? You know, this little bit of a different situation. What style of persuasion or what manner of leadership did you use with that group?
Well, it was much more collaborative. I didn't have to confront them. And so what I would do is I would have some of my reports go and have meetings with them on a regular basis and talk about legal and compliance issues. So we had a regular meeting that we'd have that I would participate in with all the companies together. And we talk about current issues, things that have come up, compliance issues, and the companies could learn from each other. But also, I sent my subordinates to go and sit in on their meetings and get information on what they were doing and come back and tell me.
And the meetings you participate in, they're all in Japanese language or in English?
They were in Japanese unless we had someone who was visiting and couldn't speak Japanese or doing it in English.
And did the Japanese team find that comforting or confronting to have a boss who can actually understand what's going on?
You know, it's a very interesting thing because there are people who want to speak English, and I'm willing to accommodate them, but not everybody's good at it. And there's some people who speak English perfectly well, but they would rather speak Japanese. So I always found the biggest challenge to be the two extremes. The people who don't speak English well but want to speak English, and the people who speak English perfectly well but want to speak Japanese. It'd be much easier, particularly if you're having a technical conversation, you know, about something work-related. It's better if you go with a language that's easier for both people. But, you know, it was very depended on who was there and what they wanted to do.
I guess sometimes, like that other company where they're hiding things from you with the email going between themselves, which you uncovered because you could read. I mean, for them, thinking that you can't understand Japanese is probably a bit of a protective barrier around themselves there, which actually wasn't a barrier protective at all. And they realized, oh, wow, this guy can actually understand what's going on. That must have been a bit unsettling for them.
Yeah, it was fun. They got over that right away. So maybe they had files at home that I didn't know about. But
well, they certainly weren't going to bring it up anyway. They did. So, what things apart from that were challenging when you started leading people in Japan?
Well, you know, I think back, and a lot of the biggest challenges were kind of HR related, where you have people who don't get along with people, or people who don't agree with people, and as a manager, you can spend a lot of time refereeing and mediating between different people who have different viewpoints or they want different things. So I found that to be, you know, I didn't mind it, but I found it to be very time-consuming.
So often people think that Western organizations are particularly political, particularly big organizations, but it's sounding like there's also a degree of political element to the Japanese organizations as well, or the Japanese in the Western organizations in the Japan case, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it really depends. I've worked for American companies that were very collaborative, and I've worked for American companies that were not. They're very political, and I worked for a company that actually changed. So I think it depends on the organization, but certainly even within a Japanese organization, there are different factions, different habatsu, and these different leaders have different visions, and sometimes they have to be reconciled.
And okay, so you've got the try and find out what's going on element. You've got some HR areas, issues between contending parties, trying to, no doubt, work their way up through their careers. What other things came up that were perhaps different from when you were in the States, when you were leading there, or things you just noticed were quite unexpected?
That's a good question. In terms of managing people, those are the two big areas. In terms of the work, working in insurance is a very highly regulated industry. So one of the big challenges was keeping up with regulation and keeping in the good graces of the regulator. So there was a lot of attention that had to be paid to what was going on in terms of regulation, and also reconciling regulation with the goals of the business.
And in this case, the regulator is the FSA, the Financial Services Agency?
When I started out, it was Ministry of Finance.
Right.
And then in 1999, I think, I can't remember, but a few years later, it switched over to FSA.
Today's show is brought to you by our public courses, but we also do custom in-house programs as well. We do these both in Japanese and English. So this show today is sponsored by two programs. A one-day program on innovational leadership, that's on March the 27th, where we go through how to get innovation from the team, how to get creativity from the team as a leader. And then we have our 3-day version of our immersion version of leadership training for managers. That's normally a 7-week program, but we also do offer it as a 3-day immersion program. So that 3-day program is coming up May 8th, 29th, and then June 19th. So leadership training for managers, May 8th, 29th, and June 19th. And the reason we split that out a little bit is because often people say, I can't take 3 days off in a row. My schedule won't allow it. I'm so busy, got so much on. Can't you break it out a bit more? So we do break it out. We give you, 1 day basically, every couple of weeks. May 8th, a little bit of a break. Then you got May 29th, and a little bit of a break. You got June 19th. Great program. I mean, this is the Swiss Army knife of leadership training. It's incredible. It covers everything. And I mean everything. Very, very, very solid program. Now, most Japanese managers got zero training, really. A little bit of on-the-job training from their bosses, who got a little bit of training from their bosses, and they got a little bit of on-the-job training from their bosses. So it's a pretty damn thin amount of content by the time it gets to this generation of leaders. Instead, you want to have the full Monty, you want to have the whole Swiss Army knife of leadership training. This is the program, Leadership Training for Managers, coming up May 8th, 29th, and then June 19th. And for those who want to get more innovation in the company going through the leadership position, innovation leadership, that's on March 27th, not that far away. Our website is full of useful resources. Go to enjapan.dalecarnegie.com. You can email me at greg.story@dalecarnegie.com. If you like learning by watching videos, we've got nearly 900 over there at Japan Dale Carnegie TV on YouTube. We release 2 TV shows every week on YouTube. The Cutting Edge Japan Business Show, that's a premier business show on Japan every Monday, Tokyo time. And Fridays we have the Japan Business Mastery Show. And also get my book, Japan Sales Mastery. That's the Bible for selling in Japan. And my other book, Japan Business Mastery, which you can get that on Amazon too. And so if you think about the team, trying to get people to be fully engaged in the company is always a bit of a struggle. And in my experience with big corporations who've got global operations, they often have employee satisfaction surveys or employee engagement survey results. And in the same way you mentioned before about some cultures are very talkative and others are not, usually, for some reason, South America is usually off the charts in terms of the engagement scores. Let's see in these things. And then you get to APAC and it'll be much lower. And then Japan would usually be the bottom of APAC with the lowest score. How did you find these, if you went through these exercises, how Japan ranked in terms of engagement? And if it wasn't ranking well, what happened about that? What sort of pressure did you come under to change that?
Well, Japan, the employees always rate the company and their job satisfaction very low in Japan.
Why is that?
I think it's just the way they are, because what we would do is we'd send the results out to headquarters and they'd come back and say, this is terrible, what's wrong? So we'd go out and get comparables from other companies, Japanese and foreign, and say, this is just the way Japanese respond to these types of surveys. So you have to take that into account. You have to give a discount for that.
And did they do that? Did they actually appreciate that and understand it?
It was a very hard sell, because particularly I think in an American company, there tends to be an attitude, it depends on the degree of international mentality, but some companies, particularly the headquarters, tend to be very domestic. And if something's different from the United States, you should change it. You see that when, for example, an American company that has no experience overseas acquires a Japanese operation, and all of a sudden, things become very, very chaotic. So I think it's a hard sell for headquarters, but if you show them the results from all the surveys across different companies, and there's a correlation, then you can make a case that this is a culture outlook rather than just your particular company. Now, if people raise specific issues in a survey, that's something else. You need to address that. But if they're just saying, I'm not happy with my job, or this company's not doing really well, you need to get the specifics before you can do anything.
And were there cases like that? Because you mentioned before in some examples the Japanese were not forthcoming, stating their opinion, and were they confident enough of the anonymity of the surveys to actually say what they thought? Were people putting down on paper or in the survey results what they really felt about things and how they were unhappy with certain elements of it, or do they shield it and keep it to themselves?
I think when it's anonymous, they tend to be more forthcoming. Mm-hmm. That it's in a group context or superior to junior context where they feel like they don't want to really express what they're thinking. If it's anonymous or if it's over drinks, it could be a little different.
So you had those experiences over drinks where people would start really telling you what they thought?
Yeah, if you went out with your employees, generally they would start to talk. Not about you, sometimes about you, but they talk about the other people, and you find out where there were little frictions or differences in opinion that you might not otherwise hear about.
And did you do that on a regular basis? Was that something as a leader you sort of said, okay, I'll have 300 days of drinkies with the team a year, or just on an ad hoc basis? So how did that work?
We would do it on an irregular basis, but it was every month or so. We'd find some reason to do that.
Would that be with different groups or with the same group, or how did you work that?
Generally, it was with my direct reports, and I expected they would do the same kind of thing with their direct reports. I didn't try to go out to dinner with all 200 people.
Yeah. Now, did you ever go beyond your direct reports directly down to people below them to sort of find out what's going on as well?
I probably should have, but I didn't. And maybe one of the reasons I didn't do that is I didn't want to undercut them. You try and hire good people, and then you have to trust in their judgment. I always tried to hire people that were smarter than I was, because I thought, well, they have my back. So I really wasn't too worried about these people as managers. If someone didn't work out, then we had to get them out of the organization. So the people I had that stayed were all very good in my estimation.
I mean, the survey results, as you say, they have a sort of cultural bias. You know, if you give Japanese people a 1 to 5 scale, they'll look for the middle of the 3 in most occasions. And so it doesn't play well globally. But just generally speaking, if you think about engagement, how did you think about things? Forget about the survey itself as an entity, but just thinking about, did you feel people were engaged? How did you try and get them to be more engaged?
Thinking about the organizations I've worked at, it's definitely easier in a smaller context to get people to come forward and really engage in a dialogue. It's a bigger challenge in a large organization where you have to kind of build it into the structure. So, it's always a challenge.
And did you have that occasion when you had to build it into the structure?
Well, what I was talking about, when, I'd have meetings with my direct reports, but I'd also send them to go to the subsidiaries and sit in on their meetings, their executive meetings and compliance meetings, and then come back and we then would also have meetings where we brought people in from the various subsidiaries, and they would all talk about developments and what they were doing. We tried to share best practices.
So you're getting a type of harmonization across the organization, right, so everyone's on the same page, so transparency is.
So, for example, if the financial services agency changed something in its rules, rather than have each company try and make an interpretation of what that meant, we get them all together. And instead of having all of them write their own internal guidelines, we come up with a template and say, this is what you should use. Saved a lot of work, saved a lot of trouble, and also meant that we got best practices. If someone had a really good code of conduct, why have somebody else write another one? Take the one that's good and give it to them.
And were they good for that? Because sometimes in not just Japan, but a lot of countries, not invented here is a bit of a barrier to sharing good and best practices. We didn't think of it, so ergo it can't be good. Thank you very much for your template. Out it goes. Did you find you could get around that, or did you have that not invented here syndrome?
Well, within the context of the companies that I worked for internally, I didn't find that big a problem. I found that problem in dealing with clients. Sometimes you would take some product to the client, and the employees wouldn't like it because they hadn't invented it. For example, in insurance companies, the actuaries have rules for underwriting. And if you take them a set of underwriting rules that are very good and produce good results, they might not care about the results. They might care that the rules are different than their rules. So even if you get a better result, they want to change the rules because they're not the rules. So I think there's a bit of that in organizations. I didn't encounter it so much in organizations where I worked internally. Certainly externally, again, it's very hard to work with clients. Yeah, knows how to do it there.
And in terms of having people engaged to the point of going the extra mile, Japan, generally speaking, is a very loyal work culture, I think, comparatively for a lot of other countries. I'm just wondering about, did you find with the teams that you were managing, they had a high sense of loyalty, the people were really thinking about the client, they were thinking about the company, they were prepared to work hard, go that extra mile, or were they, going to work, getting paid, going home? How was the tenure of that?
I think there are different personalities depending on the person. One thing that occurs to me is that even if some people were putting in long hours, they weren't necessarily very effective. So there is a tendency in Japan to stay late, but I'm not sure that it always is the most productive thing to do. There certainly is a loyalty to the company in most cases, and there certainly is a loyalty to the customers in most cases. But that working hard means producing. It doesn't mean spending a lot of time in the office.
But in Japan, it can often mean spending long hours in the office is demonstrating your commitment rather than actually being productive. It's a bit like those underwriters with the better set of rules, but not wanting to use those because it's not coming from them, so they'd rather give the company a lesser service that they're in control of rather than think about the best option for the company.
Right. I remember on one occasion, I came to the office and I opened up my email. I saw two of my employees were exchanging emails at 2 a.m. in the morning. Why are they doing that? That can't be good. They should be at home.
And what do you talk to them about?
I told them we go home. We actually have them do coaching. So you go home. I mean, if you don't have a personal life, then what's the point?
Were they the classic husbands scared of the wives hanging out of the office, or don't have to do any of the domestic duties with the baby, let me hide out of the office? Or
no, these were two single women.
Oh, single ladies.
Yes.
So they had no life apart from work, basically.
Which, I think is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Can't be good for your long-term mental health to be sending someone else an email to it.
Well, they say that government statistics show that 10% of large corporations' employees have some degree of mental health issues as a general issue across the board, all industries. And did you strike much of that in the companies? You get pretty 200 people, you're bound to have a proportion of people who've got depression, stress, constantly getting sick, having all sorts of manner of difficulties. Did you come across that at that stage, or was that back in the day where we all just sucked it up and moved on, as opposed to today where there's a bit more sensitivity about those things?
I think I'm lucky in that regard. I never had a serious issue with someone having some type of emotional or mental problem. There were a few people who had personalities that made it difficult for them to work in an organization.
In the sense of?
They didn't get along with people, or they couldn't work in a team.
Was that because they had poor communication skills, or extremely bossy, pushy personalities? What was the burr under the saddle there?
Well, in the cases that I'm thinking of that were difficult for me were people who couldn't work as a team member. They were very good at sitting in their cubicle, and if you threw work in there, they'd do it, but they couldn't collaborate with other people and work well, or they would get irritated by other people. Those are the kind of difficulties that I encountered. I didn't actually encounter problems with people having a breakdown or.
What do you do about people like that who are not team players in a team environment?
Well, you coach them out.
Now, who does the coaching?
You go to HR and you come up with a plan. And what you do is you sit down with the person and say, okay, this is the issue. And this is what you need to do.
And this is you doing that.
Right. But with the input of HR, then maybe the HR person is sitting there. And you say, all right, this is what you're not doing. This is what you need to do. Let's make a plan. And then you come back in 6 months and see how it's going. And if it's not going well, then you say, all right, it's not going well. We're going to do this one more time, but maybe this is not the place for you.
So they understood.
Yeah,
they had to fly straight, or it was going to be out the window, out the door.
I think most people who have a sense of pride and also some level of competence will find another place. The biggest challenge is the people who feel like they don't have a place to go.
And I guess going back a little bit in time, maybe today's a bit different, but going back in time, job mobility wasn't so high. And so, the shame of losing a job was high. You can't tell the family, neighbours are wondering why you're not going to work every day, and this sort of communal pressure as well. So people, even in those situations, are reluctant to try and get another job. Today's probably different because 1.6 jobs for everyone looking.
Yeah.
But, did you find that was a barrier, that they either said, well, I better really knuckle down and get to it here because I don't want to lose my job, or they just couldn't help themselves and they were just a problem?
Well, I think a couple of points. First of all, I've only worked for foreign companies in Japan. So these people were already in play. They'd already left some Japanese company and gone to work for a foreign company. We hired very few people directly out of college. We did, but it was not with this expectation that they were going to be there their entire career. So these people were already in the mindset that you could move. The second thing is, you don't fire people unless it's for cause. You coach that, maybe this isn't the place for you. If someone's really not performing, then you can fire them. If they do something that is contrary to the code of conduct, then you can fire them. But in most cases, I found that if someone wasn't fitting in, either because they didn't get along with people or they couldn't perform to the level that they had a sense, enough pride that they would look for some place that was a better fit.
In terms of, we talked before about engagement, loyalty. I guess the other part around Japan is the innovation element, the creative element, thinking outside the box element. How have you found the creativity of the teams that you've worked with?
Well, in the companies where I worked, mostly we were bringing in ideas from other countries and using them to develop new products for the Japanese market. So I found that the people in our companies were very good at taking ideas from another country, another market, and rejiggering for the Japanese market. Once in a while, we have somebody come up with a brilliant idea from the Japanese market, but usually there was some seed that came from somewhere else.
So kaizen is that continuous improvement. Right. So if you give them X, they will take X and make something a lot more out of X. They might not have thought of X themselves, but they can develop X to an extent that maybe other people can't. Did you find that?
They could adapt something for the Japanese market and make it fit. In the insurance field, a good example is Aflac, which is a large American company, large in the U.S., but it's much larger in Japan. And the reason it's large in Japan is because they started selling cancer insurance in the 1970s. And Japanese wanted it. In the U.S., if you say cancer, people are like, So it's a little bit harder to sell something that has cancer in it. But it was a big success in Japan. So you see things like that, where a product that is fairly successful in some other market that comes to Japan gets tweaked and is very successful.
What about trying to generate ideas within the team? Did you have any mechanisms, or doing off-sites, or doing creative sessions to try and see if they could develop their creative juices even further?
One of these regular meetings we had with both at the corporate level and at the subsidiary level, there was a lot of brainstorming. So the important thing is when you're working with Japanese is to kind of sit back and listen and not do all the talking and let them talk to each other and listen. So
when did you discover that?
When did I discover it? Well, I think early on. I noticed there's a tendency on the part of some foreigners, when it's quiet, they feel like they have to fill the space. And in Japan, if it's quiet, sometimes you just have to wait or ask a question. It's important not to try and fill up all the space.
So you were patient enough to wait for them to digest what they were thinking.
And then you ask questions. You listen to people's opinions, not just talk to them.
A lot of brainstorming, anywhere around the world, normally the methodologies involve, sort of 15% of the people who are most boisterous getting 95% of the ideas up on the board. And the sort of middle group, particularly the middle group in Japan, who just sort of sit there and maybe contribute a little bit, but not much. And then you've got another reasonable chunk who don't say anything. They're quite shy or they're quite silent. How did you go about getting all the ideas out when you're doing the brainstorm?
I think that's really hard in a meeting context. So what you have to do is make sure that someone is asking them for their opinions offline.
Before the meeting or after the meeting?
You make sure that the managers are asking questions of their reports. Because sometimes, speaking in a meeting, you're not going to get their opinion unless you ask them up. And if you have about 80 employees here, as I said, in my previous company, I had about 200 reports. That's too many people to canvass one-on-one. Although here, I did try and set up meetings with all the employees at the beginning, and it was hard to keep up on a regular basis. But
you were meeting them one by one, or
when I first took the position of CEO, okay. I met not all of them one-on-one. Sometimes I met them in groups of 2 or 3, depending on the function. But I think if you have a group of around 80, that's something that's doable.
And how long did you continue that for?
I think I continued it. I did it once, and then I continued on a more informal basis, not trying to do the entire group, but taking different units when something was going on and talking to people at different levels.
And did you find that, often middle management are like on one side they're a sponge on the top, so everything's coming from senior management, they're absorbing that. On the other side, they're solid concrete, they're not passing much down the line. And so often when you're in the top of the organisation, you think that your message is going right the way down to the very bottom. You actually find that when you speak to people at the bottom, they're not aware, not clear, they're not really informed, and you think, that's strange, I've been telling everybody all this stuff. How did you find getting your message from the top all the way down to the bottom? Did you find you had that sort of sponge concrete thing going on in the middle?
Well, I gave you the example of the 2 different companies, the one that would carry on a conversation and ultimately do what they were asked, and the other one that would tell you they were doing what you asked them to do, but then go ahead and do what they thought was the right thing to do. Certainly in a company that was just giving out lip service to what it was asked to do, that was a case of not getting down to the bottom. But in the case of the other company, where they were actually engaging in a dialogue and taking the decision, in order to implement it, they had to communicate it down. So, I think that if it's like the company where they're not doing what you ask, that's a big problem, because Japanese will turn any organization to a Japanese organization if they can. A not-for-profit, market share-driven organization.
That's the Japanese model.
Yeah, the Japanese model is, if you have revenue, spend it, because profits are inefficient. First you pay tax, and then you have to give it to the shareholders. It's better to have expense. You can hire more people, get a big organization. So, I think if you have a company like the one that I described, where they're engaging in a dialogue, but ultimately they agree and they go ahead, and now it's their goal. And to achieve the goal, they have to communicate it down to their subordinates. Then you don't get that concrete. But if the company is one where the foreigners say we're going to do X, and the Japanese management says, well, we know better, and X is not going to work, we're going to do Y, then you get that lack of communication going down to the bottom of the company.
Is that because they're correct?
I think the foreign companies that are successful in Japan are successful because they're not doing what all the other companies do. You think about insurance, the companies that are successful in foreign companies, they came in with a new array of products, new distribution channels. They came in with a different business model. So if the Japanese were correct, there'd just be another Japanese company. It would be a small Japanese company. It wouldn't be a growing Japanese company.
So how about, getting that sense of ownership at all levels of the company? How did you go about getting that sense of ownership in the team? We've got a vision, we've got a direction, we've got targets, we've got KPIs, we've got certain accountabilities. How did you get people to really sign on with that and be accountable themselves for those goals?
Well, I think it's a matter of tone at the top.
What was the tone that you said?
Well, working here, there's a very good culture. So it's not very hard. You just take the culture from headquarters, and they're putting out a lot of communication. They're doing a lot of interaction already. So it's just a matter of plugging into the culture of the overall organization. The problem is in a company where there's a lot of politics, a lack of collaboration, then it's all on you to do it, and that's very hard. So maybe it's time to leave that company.
Are people reading all this stuff in English from headquarters? I mean, I know that you've got departments in big organisations which are in charge of internal marketing and communication, and they are pushing out a lot of stuff. But you've got lots of stuff in your inbox and your email, and more's arriving, and it's in English. Are people actually reading this stuff?
We tend to translate everything that comes out of headquarters that is important to the overall organization. So our headquarters does everything in English and French. And then when we get it, we translate it into Japanese. So, we spend a lot of time and effort on communication in the language. I think in RGA, which 80 employees, the level of language capability tends to be very high, particularly because so many of the people who work in the organization are highly educated. Not many clerical people, more actuaries and accountants and lawyers. So
professionals.
Right. So we have a very high level of English. In a large organization where you have more broader spectrum of people, I think that communication is harder. But still, even here, we translate, even with that high level of education in all the professions, we translate everything that we deem to be important in Japanese, particularly if it's related to human resources.
So you're making a big effort.
Particularly if it's related to compliance.
You're making a big effort.
Right.
And what about, if you think about, how many years have you been in Japan now altogether, for total?
34.
34. Well, about the same. I'm 34 too. So if in your case, if you were going to give some advice to someone about to take up a post in Japan with their company, or they just arrived in Japan with their company, and they're about to start their posting in Japan, what would be 3 pieces of advice you give someone like that to be successful in Japan?
Is this someone who has an interest in Japan or someone who's been transferred out cold?
Oh, it's probably going to be both. I mean, how do you define that? I mean, you're going to get both varieties. Let's assume you've got both varieties then. Give us the I'm signed on variety advice, and give us the I've just turned up gal advice.
Well, I think for people who've signed on, people like you or people like me who've been here a long time, the challenge is not that great because we got interested at some point and decided we would be there. I think the bigger problem is for someone who has been assigned by their company and has never taken interest in Japan, and now they're here.
Mm-hmm. If they're American, they probably didn't have a passport.
Right. So for those people, I'd say the biggest challenge is your family, the trailing spouse, and the children. So you need to make sure that they are engaged in school or club or some other type of activity, so that you're not just sitting at home watching the limited amount of English cable that they can get. So that's, I think, the first thing. Second, at work, I've seen instances where people come out from headquarters and they say, "What are you doing and why are you doing it?" And that's not what we do in the U.S., or that's not what we do in New York. So you need to change. What people should do is first understand why things are the way they are. Now, again, foreign companies get ahead in many instances because they're bringing something from overseas and introducing it to Japan. But you can't just take it as is, and you have to know why people are doing things the way they are. What's the regulatory scheme? How do people view this type of product? How is it sold? You need to do some studying. You can't just say, "I'm from the United States," and that's the best country in the world. So if you're not doing it the way we do it in the United States, you're not doing it the best way. That creates a lot of problems. So the way to avoid that is spend some time. I think most companies are pretty good at getting people oriented. Spend some time learning about the culture, about the industry, and about how things are done in this market.
You draw that line though between, okay, this is how we do it in Japan, but why don't we do it in a different way and get an edge on our competition, or give the market something new and fresh? That's a very tricky line to draw, isn't it? To find out, as you say, certain companies have brought in that cancer insurance in the 70s. That was a completely new thing. People probably aghast at the time, but it's proven incredibly successful. That was a decision which was probably an American-driven decision rather than a local decision, which proved to be a good one. How do you differentiate? Is this just being pig-headed because I'm coming from my culture and my system, or is this, can I move the needle over here a bit by getting Japan to change a little bit?
Yeah, I think that organizations need a degree of maturity in the market. So you have people who've been here for a while, and you have a good mix of Japanese managers as well. I see some foreign organizations kind of say, "Okay, well, we're going to go Japanese. We're not going to have any foreigners. We're going to turn management over to Japanese." Well, what happens then is you get a completely Japanese organization. I've seen organizations where they bring in a layer of foreigners and put them on top of all the Japanese. People who don't have a lot of experience in Japan coming in and forming a layer on top. That doesn't work well either. What you need is a good mix of Japanese and foreign executives, and the foreigners need a good mix of people who have experience in the market and people who come with new ideas so that they can work with each other and have a dialogue and come up with the best approach. If you have too much of one or the other, and if you have a completely American organization in Japan, it's not going to go very well. If you have a completely Japanese organization, it's just going to be another Japanese company. So the advantage, I think, from being
until the next episode, take what you thought valuable, put it into action, because idea application is what makes winners winners. So be one of them. Remember, I'm your corporate coaching and training guy here in Japan, ready to help you grow your business.